If you missed Chad Snyder's sermon last week, I recommend you take the time to listen to it. It's available through the News from the Office and on our webpage if you select sermons from the pull-down menu titled Connect. Chad spoke about being curious listeners and learners about other faiths. He challenged us to be kind of brutally honest about preconceived stereotypes coming from a stance of believing that we are right and others are misguided. With authentic curiosity and authentic curiosity as a guide, he points the way for us to learn to be people and the community that values religious differences and paves the way for future interfaith relationships. He challenges us to stay open. He challenged us to admit and to check our own self-righteousness and ignorance when it comes to understanding other faiths and their perspectives. I have to say, the reading that Lisa did, I didn't know all of those things that were cited in that reading. Chad asked us to lean into curiosity instead of fear or separation. I've heard the saying that the work of religion is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. I'd say that Chad was leaning into the latter in last week's sermon, and given the response of those who heard it, the message was well received. Yes, we say, this is how we want to be in the world. This generous and curious spirit is what we want to embody. Yes. And then there is the reality of living out that value and aspiration, living out that aspiration during times that we are longing for, or maybe the times that we longed for in the past. We come to our own religious beliefs and philosophical perspectives and religious baggage, holding those closely. Some of us have wounds from being raised or interacting with people of other faiths. I know that I begin each day historied and complex as a person who isn't always in control of what surfaces or what gets triggered. But we have choices in terms of how we look at and how we hold our own experiences and those of others. To live into an aspiration takes action and work. Both of those will get us to a place of greater knowledge and compassion and love for others and for ourselves. It always kind of reminds me of that the first of our principles with the inherent worth and dignity of others. It sounds so easy, and yet to really practice that, it takes a lot of work. So one of my favorite takeaways from Chad's sermon last week was when he cited Bishop Stengel's 3 guidelines for religious understanding. They are, when trying to understand another religion, you should ask the adherents of that religion and not its enemies. He said that you don't compare your best to their worst, and you leave room for holy envy. I think it's so easy to flatten the descriptions of others, to paint a caricature that is an invitation to dismiss others, especially when it comes to doctrinal or dogmatic faiths. And yet nothing is monolithic, even though it may feel or be depicted that way. So before I kind of go on and talk about us stretching our muscles in terms of the practice, I do want to say that it's important to name the current context, that in these past few years, we have had extreme challenges for our spirits on many, many levels. Grief and fear and worry and stress feel inescapable for most of us. The world feels chaotic and unpredictable, and some would go so far as to potentially say doomed. Wells run dry. Tanks are empty. Name whatever metaphor you want to talk about, but I just want to say that with whatever we expect of ourselves and of others may need to be sprinkled with a little extra kindness, because I do believe that none of us are operating as our best selves at this time. I know for myself, there is this weariness that comes with this current reality, and yet on this micro level, at this small congregation in Fridley, there's this cosmic shift occurring. We're not waiting it out, whatever it may be. Instead, we're actively seeking ways to gather and to move us from a sense of complacency to a space of greater risk and embracing the unknown. We've connected with the joy of being together in person at a new location, not today due to the storm, but we've had 8 Sundays so far worshiping at Fridley Middle School. And we continue to explore how we will create a church community at this time and in the future. So at last week's board meeting, we were asked a question that many of you have been asked in past congregational workshops on mission and planning. And if you haven't been part of this congregation during such workshops, you may have been asked such questions in other parts of your work life. The question was, what headline or news or highlighted photo might we see on the MSUS website 6 to 18 months from now? Do you sense energy or momentum for this already? So it was a question about dreaming. It wasn't really necessarily what we can get to in the 6 or 18-month timeline, though we may. We know that it's good to dream. It's good for our spirits and our brains because we are wired in that way that when we envision something, our brains start finding a way to make it happen. Creating mental blocks or doubting possibility or focusing primarily on what is wrong is sure to destroy the energy and the joy and the synergy that can come from being open to what is good and possible. So there were many compelling headlines spoken at the meeting. The images pointed towards energy and connection and a vibrant and open community. My headline was that our congregation launches a new interfaith center in the northern suburb. That headline stems from what we've been up to over the past few months and my hopes that we can answer that desire of so many of us to be a congregation that reaches outward as well as inward. In the past few months, as we put our Oakley Drive building on sale and sold it, we've been exploring where we could hold Sunday services and music rehearsals. A group of us spent some time touring and talking with a Lutheran church in Columbia Heights, and the minister and I had connected when I was out doing some one-on-ones looking for progressive faith leaders who wanted to collaborate in raising what John Lewis calls good trouble. This minister said there was space in the building, and so a core group of us went over there and we wandered the building and we could see possibilities for ways that we could have our congregation's needs met, and more importantly, have an opportunity for learning and collaboration. During that time, 4 of us took a series of classes there called Discussing Race and Racism, even when it's uncomfortable, and we could see ourselves cross-pollinating, joining in on each other's programs and service projects and community meals and even music and worship. Unfortunately, at that time, it wasn't really right for that church. The Board of Trustees was unable to move forward. We can revisit it now, but they just weren't ready to lock in on sharing space for an unknown period of time. What became evident in that conversation about sharing space was the thought of being housed in a Christian church was challenging for some. Ghosts from the past whispered in our ears, past experiences and broad stereotypes about people of Christian faith surfaced. But that's not where I want to focus today. Instead, I want to return to our congregation's values and our basic principles as Unitarian Universalists. As we've moved into this liminal space of renting versus owning, I found myself questioning whether this rugged individualism of owning our own church makes sense. My mind goes to the strategic question of, is it really cost efficient? It goes to the values questions around our environmental footprint and our stated vision of building authentic connections across lines of difference and acting as a trusted and committed partner with organizations that bring more in love and justice in the world. Does owning a building primarily for ourselves keep us too insulated? Does it push us to grow? Is it the best path to opening our spirits and our minds? can we imagine something different going forward? It isn't really easy to change and grow, especially when we spend so much of our time through the week in the same circles. I feel like this Zoom world has even accentuated that because we almost always know who's going to be on calls. And yet I know for me that when I change, it's often through friction and the unknown. It's through those growing edges when something is asked of me that I didn't anticipate. I've grown when some perspective or way of being in my past is revealed as no longer aligned with my own moral compass. In her book, Fluent in Faith, Jeannie Newarjar reminds us that the only way out of discomfort is through it. The discomfort she calls out in her book is that of Unitarian Universalist when it comes to the language of faith. She says, or she asks us to move out of our own more staid comfort zones and to expand it, to practice pushing the envelope of language and ideas that may feel closed to us today in order to open up and to be willing and engaged more broadly with people of other faiths and within our own. She says that for many of us, using traditional religious words feels like a foreign language. The cadence is halting, the nuance is uncertain. Ghosts from the past whisper in our ears, and we become more focused on that linguistic struggle than on the meaning we want to convey, on the meanings we want to hear. I know I'm guilty of this. I can hear words and I can just shut down sometimes, particularly some religious words. So she shares this story about a workshop of 16 religious educators and asking them, how comfortable are you with using the word God? Only one raised their hand at very comfortable. A few raised their hands to somewhat comfortable, and the rest she said admitted to varying degrees of not at all or not very. Just think of that young man in that reading who carries this calligraphy version of the 99 names of God, looking into that workshop. Most likely his world is made up of people who believe in God. How do we bridge that gap? And does it matter if we do? We know that language represents something deeper in us. Newarjar says that how we speak correlates with how we listen. She says, as we listen to our neighbors talk about their religious journeys, we often find ourselves bristling at some of the words they use. Our listening then will not be open or affirming. Our attention will get stuck in linguistics, and we will drift away from the experiences or the feelings being expressed. We will raise our defenses. She says, when we're uncomfortable, much of our energy is given over to our own feelings and needs. We find ourselves wanting to argue or challenge without offering the gift of deep listening. As I hear her words, I think about that, moving into our own feelings and needs, and how this sort of openness ends up becoming so much smaller. I really appreciate her insight. There is a truth that when we strip away words that are connected to faith that make us feel uncomfortable, we often end up with the lowest common denominator, and that often lacks any substance and can erase many people's truths. So listen, though, I am a UU minister for a reason, and one of them is that I value the many paths one can take to express and find the holy, to that feeling of awe and wonder. I love the words that we use to express the depth of human hope and longing and despair. And I do struggle with words and religious ideas that I have decided personally to not keep as my own. And yet I long to be in a world where interfaith connections are an avenue to greater understanding and relationship, where my and our comfort and beliefs are not always in the center. I long to be around people who are led to the work of justice and community care through their own faith. So I challenge myself and us to work through our discomfort with religious language, if discomfort exists. I challenge us to diligently follow Bishop Stengel's 3 guidelines for religious understanding, catching ourselves and each other when we fall into the trap of his first 2 guidelines. When we are trying to understand another religion, we should ask the adherents of that religion and not their enemies. I know we often look for the argumental sides, that side of the enemies, but he says, try to listen to the people who are the adherents. And then he also says, don't compare your best to their worst. And I think one of the gifts that Chad gave us last week was perhaps highlighting, maybe not the worst, but some of the behaviors we have that aren't necessarily the ones we are most proud of. And I challenge myself and us to leave room for holy envy, which is described as how we can be inspired and motivated by the devotion of other religions, even if we do not necessarily adopt their beliefs or their practices. So part of the reason I chose that the reading today that Lisa read, was that I had an experience last week that I just want to reflect briefly with all of you about. This past year, I joined a newly formed interfaith organization called Minnesota Multi-Faith Network, or MM. A woman, Leslie, contacted me after my second meeting. I had mentioned that we were selling our building and on Oakley Drive, and she was part of an organization that was interested in finding a new home. The organization is the Turkish American Society of Minnesota, known as TASMIN. Boy, I love that another organization's leaning into those acronyms. Leslie's married to a board member of that organization. So they were one of several organizations that bid on our Oakley Drive building, and when that didn't work out, we committed to stay in touch. After looking at the church building in Brooklyn Center, I contacted Leslie to see if they'd seen it, thinking maybe they'd want to rent from us if we ended up buying it. She said they were on their way to the building. But afterwards, when we had a conversation, she said that that building was less appealing, but it holds some promise. So once again, Leslie and I agreed to stay in relationship. We talked about doing some shared learning and connecting our leadership. Soon thereafter, I was invited to a lunch by Tolga, who is the executive director of TASMIN. This was all by email, and he said it would be an interfaith lunch, which really wasn't terribly descriptive. We met at Sheesh in St. Paul, a restaurant known for its Mediterranean cuisine. I arrived first, and really, honestly, I had no idea what the lunch was about. He was in a booth in the back of the restaurant, and I gathered my stuff and ended up in the far corner of that booth. Before I knew it, it was me and 5 men. There were 2 men who were from the Center for Interreligious Studies at both St. Ben's and St. John's, and then the other one was from St. Thomas. There was this guy, John Powell, who actually wrote a fascinating article back when the Marriage Amendment was happening, challenging the Lutheran Core, which was a group who was trying to fight against the Marriage Amendment. And he talked about how civil religion and American civil religion and white male backlash was at the core of religious bigotry against marriage and GLBT folks. Then there was Tolga, who is the executive director of TASMIN, and another younger man who is working with Tolga. Throughout the lunch, there was so much laughter. And I got to say, for me, there was so much learning. I didn't know about Turkish history. I didn't know about the persecution of the Turkish Muslims, who are the folks who kind of make up this organization here in Minnesota. Oh, I just had so much curiosity during that lunch. And I think as that lunch went on and new people kept coming in, Tolga said, "Oh, this is Laura. She's a Unitarian Universalist minister, and we might share a building someday." Lunch conversation uncovered connections with Valparaiso, where my son is working, and connections with Sheesh, because it's one of his favorite restaurants. There was this spark. There was energy. There was hope. There was care, and there was joy. So I think about what's ahead. I have questions in my heart about where we may go, and I have some excitement about thinking that this little Unitarian Universalist church based in the northern suburbs might find a way to become something bigger and bolder than we've been in the past. This question of language, this question of understanding is something that I feel a personal call to grapple with, and I hope you will as well. I have some other goals for the spring, but maybe this summer we'll do a reading around the language of faith, how to be fluent in faith and challenge ourselves to use those words or to somehow grapple with them, to find space for them, to find care for people who believe in ideas and religious concepts we may not agree with. So as we move into discussion this morning, I'm wondering how you grapple with those words of faith or about those whispers in your ears that tell you to shut down instead of open up. I wonder about how does this question of whether we may end up sharing or joining others, does that worry you? Does it excite you? And maybe even you could share a story like what the reading gave us, that reading that said, how she handled that picture in a way that wasn't actually respectful. And have you had moments like that when some gentle soul taught you how to be a better person of faith? Diana, I'll let you try to facilitate if folks have things to say.
All right. Checking chat. So far, I don't see any hands. Beth Strootman put in chat, what's ahead? Wow, a whole lot of deep and challenging food for thought. Thank you, Beth. Katie's hand is up. Go ahead, Katie. And then Jesse, I see you next.
So last week and this week's sermons are kind of dovetailing with a little class I'm taking about a communications class. And so like melding all these ideas together. One thing that comes to mind when talking about, communicating across a divide, I guess, is that one goal of that communication, or maybe we shouldn't think of the goal of that communication so much as finding common ground, which a lot of times is what people talk about, but rather that these challenging conversations, that each one could get us into a little bit more of a nuanced conversation, rather than it's so easy to say, I'm on this side and you're on that side. And all we kind of talk at each other and ensure that we know where the boundaries of that division are. And it just seems really valuable to think about the idea of a little bit more nuance each time might bring understanding.
I see Jesse and then Deb Schneider and then Polly.
So for me, I do cringe when I hear people using religious words that I've sort of removed from my own understanding. But I also, as a UU, try to respect each person's belief. And one of the things that I've come to understand over time is that God, whatever God is to us or to everyone, presents itself in a way that makes sense to each individual person. When I was growing up, to me, God looked like an old man with a long white beard. Now I see God as an energy versus a being. But each person, I believe, we all have an understanding of some sort of a creator or a facilitator. And it's just different to each of us. And that's okay. And I'm trying to, remind myself that it's okay if somebody believes that the only way to heaven is Jesus, for example. That's not what I believe, but that's what makes sense to them. And I find it easier to not turn away from those words in my head when I hear or when I think of that concept.
Thanks,
Thank
Jesse.
you. Deb, you're next.
Well, to echo really what Jesse's saying, I feel like in the past couple of years, I've really come to embrace more that we're more alike than we are different. And when some of my Facebook friends call for prayers, rather than being, oh, I'm not going to pray, it's like, what would you do? You would send positive energy. You would look for the energy of the universe to embrace them. How is that so different from a prayer? And I personally am very excited about the idea of potentially, sharing a building with more organizations, getting more involved in the community, and really, finding all those places. We took the kids years and years ago over to the Islamic Center over here. And I admit I didn't really understand the origin of Ramadan until it was explained to me by children who were studying Arabic. And the last thing that our host said was that we're all more, we all are more alike than we are different. And I've carried those words with me ever since. And I'm starting to get to the point where I'm not going to get hung up on the semantics.
Thanks,
Deb,
Deb.
I do believe that Tasman may have been the organization that ran the Islamic Center. So it's interesting, these like little loops that come around, so thank you for your reflection.
Polly, you're next.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm so tied with this right now, and it, Chad's speaking, and then today, and I have no problem with Islam and Muslims. One of my workers is Muslim, and she prays here. I bought her a prayer rug so she'd have one here, and I have no problem with Judaism. I think of them as being people who have been really pushed around in this whole world, and that they're just trying to do their own thing. But my hackles come up with Christianity, and I immediately go to a gut response of no, that I won't let that in, that it can harm me. And some of that stems definitely from when Kathleen was dying, and her Catholic mom really pulled some nasty stunts. Some of it goes to the marriage issue, and how deeply I seen people around me wanting to get married, and that they were thought of as a bad thing. And these are good people, but I have no solution with what I'm saying. I'm just saying I have a problem with Christianity, and it's something I need to look at.
Polly, thank you for your honesty. And I think that Marilyn put something sort of cringe. She's talked about sort of cringeworthy when religion is used against others. And I guess I think why I thought that Bishop's words were so helpful was when he was saying, don't compare your best to their worst. And that, within Christianity, there is the worst. We got some pretty bad UUs as well. But in the middle, and in the liberal, the progressive side, there's people who have been fighting within their traditions to love everybody, to, fight for queer rights. I was really interested to find this man who was raised Missouri Synod was the one who took on with his scholarly ability to fight against the Lutheran core. He said his article was broadly read during the marriage amendment fight. So to just remember, I think it's that remembering that it's not just one, that's a part of it, but not all of it. So thank you so much for your honesty.
I have Kathy Burek, and then Beth, I saw your hand next, and then I'll read some things from chat.
Thank you, Laura, for raising the question of whether or not we need to own a building for our exclusive use. I think that's an important question. Even before COVID, the trends were very much going against the idea that people have to show up at a certain time, certain day of the week in person in order to have a religious experience. And so it's a good thing to say, do we really need to do this? And if not, what is it we really need to do in person? How do we facilitate that? And having some interfaith connections, I think, is really important. We don't always have to share a theology in order to be able to work on issues of common concern. Where I draw lines is I remember the Sophia Lyons-Fa's thoughts about it matters what we believe. And so we can be in relationship with people while not accepting everything some of them believe. I think it's James Baldwin who said that we can have the difference of opinion as long as your opinion doesn't amount to your denial of my humanity. And I think we can put boundaries around the interfaith and say, yeah, there are certain people we can work with and certain people where, no, thank you, we just don't have enough in common.
Beth, you're
Thanks,
up.
Kathy.
I don't have a problem with other faiths. My discomfort comes, I've made friends here in my building, and learning through conversations and all about the strength of their beliefs and the importance to them, and sensing with some kind of a rigidity or an expectation. I hesitate to be truly myself and reveal my beliefs because I feel like they'll think less of me. And yet there's a part of me that at my age, I think, well, when will it be time to be true to myself?
Thanks, Beth. All right, so I'm going to share some comments from the chat. Pamela said, agree wholeheartedly on faiths which are not inclusive with other beliefs. I was in India and just awed and even cried out of the beauty I saw there. People live their faiths, daily temple before anything else in their day. It's not saved for one day of the week. One Hindu person there said they welcome other people's idea of God. What is one more God when they already have so many? Mel said, I would hope that sharing space and time with different faith groups would provide me an opportunity to grow in strength and compassion. Faith said, a few years ago, I went to an interfaith group and there was a response that my religion is holy and we don't just intellectualize about it. So quit using our religion to satiate your curiosity. Just accept it is what it is. I still struggle with that as I value reason so much. Jen says, what the past 2 years have reinforced for me is that as a community with great affection and trust in each other, it feels like the right time to stretch ourselves in being uncomfortable together because we can be that vulnerable with each other now. And something I thought of as I was listening to all of you is that one of my ministers long before I went into ministry had been trained as a community organizer before she became a minister. And in some service, she shared a learning that she took from that community organizing training about working with people when you have an area in common and pretty significant differences. And the example she gave was that there in Colorado, she partnered with many other interfaith colleagues in the area, including Catholics. And she said, now we're never going to partner with the Catholics on reproductive justice, but we can partner with them on immigration. And in Colorado, we were having lots of immigration issues. There's an ICE detention center there and so on. So, you know, that she wasn't waiting to find partners that we agreed with on all points, and even had some pretty significant differences of opinion. But we could still find areas where we could work together while holding what Kathy said about, I believe it was Kathy who was talking about not partnering with people who are doing harm to people who are part of our community or people we love. So looking for that common ground without expecting perfection.
Thank you, Diana. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Marilyn just added in chat, speaking out is difficult for me and use of the covenant of UU faith has helped me.
It's a great way to end.
I'm not seeing any more hands. I think that's.
Thank you all for your honesty. I do want to say one thing that as I mentioned, I went into UU ministry, and I think part of it is that we can have such conversations respectively and vulnerably, and trying to learn from one another and open our hearts wider. So thank you all for your comments and thoughts today. Our closing hymn is going to be hymn 159. This is my song. It doesn't have much to do necessarily with the theme for the day, but I just can't get the people of the Ukraine out of my heart and out of my mind. And this song just always reminds me of our interconnectedness with people around the world. So we will all be muted. Chad will do his magic, and we can sing from home or simply listen.